He's changing his surname. A true father is adopting him, my ex beamed. I calmly co-signed. Days later, her dad stormed in, pale and shaking, holding a letter. The trust. He gasped. Tell me you didn't just let him surrender the entire estate. The room went completely quiet when I finally set my glass down on the edge of the long marble table. Well, maybe not the entire room. Outside, near the glowing blue swimming pool, the younger kids were still splashing and screaming, completely oblivious to the heavy tension settling over the patio. And on the other side of the massive, meticulously manicured lawn, my ex-wife's side of the family was too busy grinning at each other, clinking their champagne flutes together like they had just conquered a small nation. But right around the immediate circle where I sat, there was a thin, suffocating ripple of silence. I am Alistair Hawthorne, 45 years old, a man who has always preferred the quiet weight of history over the loud, brassy noise of modern wealth. And today, I found myself sitting directly in the center of the loudest, most obnoxious display of new money I had ever seen. The party was being held at a sprawling estate in Connecticut, a towering monstrosity of glass, white stucco, and unnecessary gold-plated fixtures that belonged to Montgomery Sinclair. Montgomery was the man my ex-wife, Caroline, had married just 14 months ago. He was the kind of guy who thought wearing sunglasses indoors and leasing a new European sports car every 6 months made him some sort of visionary. I looked up at the head of the table. Standing there, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the fairy lights strung above the patio, was my son, Donovan. He was exactly 17 years and 11 months old, just 1 month shy of his 18th birthday, 1 month away from legal adulthood. He stood tall, adjusting the lapels of a brand-new, custom-tailored navy blazer. It was a beautiful piece of clothing, undeniably expensive, but what caught my eye, what was meant to catch everyone's eye, was the elaborate gold embroidery stitched directly over the left breast pocket. It was a monogram. A large, ornate letter S for Sinclair. He wore it like a badge of honor, puffing his chest out as he looked across the crowd. He actively avoided making eye contact with me, his biological father, the man sitting less than 10 feet away. Instead, Donovan faced the rest of the guests, holding up his crystal glass like a seasoned showman playing to a packed theater. I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming out tonight, Donovan started, his voice projecting easily over the soft classical music playing from the hidden outdoor speakers. This past year has been a massive transition for me. And if I am being totally honest, I am finally done with the heavy, boring expectations of the Hawthorne name. I am taking the last name of someone I actually respect. Someone who knows how to actually live life. A wave of low, sycophantic laughter rippled through Caroline's friends. A few raised their eyebrows, casting sideways glances at me to see if I would snap, if I would throw my drink, if I would cause the kind of pathetic, jealous scene Caroline had clearly been hoping for. Caroline let out this delighted, breathy little gasp, bringing a hand to her chest as if she hadn't personally rehearsed that exact line with him a dozen times in front of the bathroom mirror earlier that afternoon. She looked practically radiant, feeding off the drama like a vampire. Then Montgomery, the upgraded model apparently, stood up from his oversized chair at the head of the table. He leaned over, wrapping a thick arm around Donovan's shoulders, and tapped his champagne flute against my son's glass. "Welcome to the real family now, son," Montgomery said, his voice booming and full of unearned confidence. He smiled out at the crowd, a wide, predatory grin that reminded me of a wolf who had just managed to convince a flock of extremely gullible sheep that he was their new shepherd. They looked so immensely proud of themselves. So self-congratulatory. They truly believed they had just rewritten history. They thought the name Hawthorne was just some dusty, heavy coat that Donovan could simply toss into the garbage and trade in for a sleeker, shinier, more modern jacket. A name that was easier to brag about at high society cocktail parties. I just sat there, my expression perfectly neutral, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. They thought I was a defeated man. They had no idea what they had just set in motion. As the applause died down and the guests began to eagerly dig into their catered lobster tails and prime rib, I felt a strange, detached numbness wash over me. I wasn't crying. My hands weren't shaking. I wasn't even angry, not in the hot, explosive way you would expect a man to be when his own flesh and blood publicly disowns him. Instead, my mind began to automatically flip through a massive, invisible catalog of the past 17 years. I looked at Donovan, who was currently laughing at a joke Montgomery had made, throwing his head back in a way that looked so forced, so practiced. The boy wearing the Sinclair crest was a stranger to me. But the boy I raised? I knew every single part of him. I remembered a freezing Tuesday night in the middle of January, about 11 years ago. Donovan was just 6 years old, struggling with a terrifying bout of severe asthma. Caroline had been out of town on some vague networking retreat she claimed was absolutely essential for her personal brand. I had stayed up for 36 straight hours, holding a tiny plastic oxygen mask to Donovan's face in the emergency room, singing his favorite lullabies until my throat was entirely raw, just to keep him from panicking. I remembered teaching him how to drive in the empty parking lot of a local community college, gripping the dashboard so hard my knuckles turned white while he ground the gears of my old truck. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, night after night, trying to patiently explain the concepts of algebra to him while he threw his pencil across the room in frustration. I remembered sacrificing weekends, canceling golf trips, turning down promotions that would have required me to travel, all because I fundamentally believed that a father's presence was the most valuable currency in the world. When he was 8, I actually sold a pristine, cherry red 1968 Mustang Fastback. It was a car I had spent 5 years restoring with my own 2 hands. I sold it to a private collector without a second thought because Donovan needed specialized speech therapy that our insurance flat out refused to cover. And Caroline had just spent $10,000 redesigning the landscaping in our backyard and refused to cancel the contractor. But none of that mattered now. All those quiet, invisible sacrifices, all those hours of genuine, grinding fatherhood, were completely erased in one single afternoon photo op. They were totally nullified by a man who had swooped in just 14 months ago with deep pockets and a desperate need for a ready-made family. Montgomery didn't help Donovan with his homework. He bought him a tutor who charged $300 an hour. Montgomery didn't teach him the value of $1. He just handed the kid a black credit card with no limit and told him to go crazy at the mall. In the last 6 months alone, Montgomery had taken Donovan on 2 yacht trips to the Caribbean and bought him a vintage Rolex watch for getting a B- on a history exam. To a 17-year-old boy whose brain was still developing, whose ego was easily inflated by flashing lights and expensive gifts, I was just the strict, boring guy who made him do chores and respect curfews. Montgomery was the fun uncle who somehow became dad. And Caroline? She was the architect of the entire illusion, constantly whispering in Donovan's ear that my disciplined, quiet lifestyle was toxic, while Montgomery's flashy, throw money at the problem approach was what true love looked like. I watched Donovan take a sip of champagne, something Montgomery actively encouraged despite him being underage. The kid actually puffed his chest out, adjusting that stupid navy blazer like he had done something to earn it. Like all those nights I stayed up after working double shifts were somehow less real, less valid than the few months of private tennis lessons and luxury vacations the new guy threw at him. You know what? I thought to myself, leaning back in my chair. Let him have the yacht. Let them all sip their expensive champagne on the deck while the ship slowly, inevitably takes on water. Because as they grinned, as the hired photographer's camera clicked away, capturing their perfect, synthetic family moments, I knew the absolute truth. I wasn't mourning the loss of a name. I was preparing to unleash a reality check so devastating, they wouldn't even know what hit them until the ground completely fell out from underneath their feet. Dessert was being served, tiny, pretentious slices of gold leaf chocolate cake, when Caroline finally made her move. She stood up, smoothed down the front of her expensive silk dress, and walked over to my end of the table. She was holding a thick, manila envelope. Montgomery trailed closely behind her, standing just a few feet away with his arms crossed over his chest, trying to look intimidating. He looked more like a bouncer at a cheap nightclub than a patriarch. The low hum of conversation around the patio died down instantly. Every single guest stopped eating. Eyes darted toward our corner of the patio. This was the main event. This was the drama Caroline had promised her friends. "Alistair," Caroline said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, condescending tone. She pulled a stack of crisp, heavy cardstock papers from the envelope and placed them flat on the table right next to my water glass. "These are the final voluntary adoption and name change consent forms. My lawyer has already gone over everything. All we need is your signature on the bottom line. It makes the transition completely official." She paused, taking a deliberate breath, preparing herself for the fight. "Look, I know this is hard for you. I know you feel like you are losing your son. But you have to look at the bigger picture here. Montgomery can provide things for Donovan that you simply cannot. Opportunities, connections, a lifestyle that fits his true potential. If you really, truly love him, you won't make a scene. You will do the right thing and let him go." I didn't respond right away. I looked down at the papers. They were immaculate, fresh from the printer, completely unblemished. The legal text was dense, but the meaning was simple. By signing this, I was legally surrendering all parental rights and agreeing to let the state completely expunge the Hawthorne name from Donovan's birth certificate, replacing it entirely with Sinclair. I glanced past Caroline and looked at Donovan. He was standing near the edge of the patio, holding his breath, watching me with wide eyes. He looked nervous, but there was a hard, defiant set to his jaw. He wanted this. He actually believed this was his grand liberation. Everyone assumed I had come to this party with a desperate, last-ditch plea. Caroline's friends were practically leaning out of their chairs, waiting for me to beg, to cry, to slam my fists on the table and cause a massive, embarrassing scene. They wanted me to yell about how ungrateful they were. They wanted me to fight so Caroline could play the victim, so Montgomery could step in and play the hero. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my own pen. A heavy, silver fountain pen my grandfather had given me when I graduated college. I didn't hesitate. Not for a single, solitary second. I uncapped the pen, leaned forward, and signed my name on the bottom line of the first page. Then I flipped to the second page and signed again. My hand was perfectly steady. The only sound in the dead quiet of the patio was the sharp, distinct scratch of the metal nib gliding across the thick paper. When I finished, I capped the pen, slid it back into my pocket, and pushed the stack of papers back across the marble table toward Caroline. "You want to go?" I said, my voice completely calm, barely above a conversational volume, yet carrying clearly in the silent air. I looked directly into Donovan's eyes. "Then go all the way." Caroline just stood there, stunned into absolute silence. Her mouth parted slightly. The smug, victorious smile completely melted off her face, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. She blinked rapidly, looking down at my signature, then back up at me. This wasn't the script she had written in her head. "That's it?" Montgomery asked, his deep voice faltering for the first time all evening. He sounded almost disappointed. "You're not going to fight this?" "There is nothing left to fight for," I replied evenly. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the stone patio, and stood up. I didn't say goodbye to Caroline. I didn't wish Montgomery well. And I didn't give Donovan one last, lingering look of paternal sorrow. I simply turned my back on the lavish party, walked down the grand brick pathway, and got into my car. As I drove away from the towering iron gates of the Sinclair estate, the night air felt incredibly crisp and clean. They thought they had just won a war. They didn't realize they had just gleefully jumped out of an airplane without a parachute, completely unaware that I was the one holding the only safety net. The drive from Connecticut back to my home in upstate New York took just over 3 hours. By the time my tires crunched against the long gravel driveway leading up to my house, it was well past midnight. My property was the exact opposite of Montgomery Sinclair's flashy, modern monstrosity. It was a 200-year-old stone manor, sitting on 40 acres of dense, quiet forest. It didn't have gold fixtures or a glowing blue pool. It had heavy oak doors, original brick fireplaces, and a deep, enduring silence. I walked through the front door, shrugging off my suit jacket and tossing my keys onto the entryway table. I didn't turn on the main overhead lights. I navigated through the familiar, moonlit hallways until I reached my private study. It was a room lined wall-to-wall with dark mahogany bookshelves, smelling faintly of old paper, leather, and wood smoke. I walked over to the small crystal decanter sitting on my side table, poured myself 2 fingers of a 50-year-old rye whiskey, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The burn in my throat was grounding. Then, I walked over to the oil painting hanging above the fireplace, swung it open on its hidden hinges, and revealed the heavy steel wall safe built directly into the stone. I spun the dial, entered the combination, and pulled the heavy metal door open. Inside, resting on a velvet shelf, was the Hawthorne family trust binder. It was massive, weighing at least 10 pounds, bound in thick, dark brown leather that was cracked with age. I carried the binder over to my massive oak desk, turned on a single brass reading lamp, and dropped the heavy book onto the wooden surface with a loud, satisfying thud. Most people in Caroline's circle thought the wealth in our family was passive and boring. They thought it was just a nice stock portfolio, a couple of dusty old buildings in Virginia, and maybe a few antique paintings. Caroline used to mock me for not upgrading my lifestyle, constantly comparing my quiet conservatism to the aggressive, flashy spending of the men she networked with. But what Caroline, Montgomery, and unfortunately my son never understood is that real, terrifying power doesn't scream. It whispers. The Hawthorne estate wasn't just a bank account you could swipe a debit card against. It was an institution. It was a complex, multi-billion-dollar structure built over a century ago by my great-grandfather. It controlled vast tracts of commercial real estate, held majority voting rights in a dozen major energy firms, and managed an educational foundation that handed out grants larger than the GDP of some small island nations. It was a fortress. And the only key to get inside that fortress was the Hawthorne name. I opened the heavy leather cover and flipped past the corporate charter, past the asset lists, past the foundation bylaws, until I reached page 43. The page was slightly yellowed, the edges worn from decades of fingers tracing the text. Right in the middle of the page, highlighted by a faint underline from a fountain pen long ago, was the text I needed. Provision 12C, Clause Title, Inheritance Rights Tied to Legal Surname. I had read it so many times over the years I could practically recite it in my sleep. It was written in the kind of dense, suffocating legal jargon that makes most people's eyes glaze over, but the translation was brutally simple. The provision stated that eligibility for all trust disbursements, voting rights, directorships, property privileges, and educational subsidies shall be strictly limited to verified bloodline members who retain continuous legal use of the Hawthorne surname. Then came the subsection. The executioner's block. In the event of a formal, court-recognized disassociation by a voluntary name change or adoption, all privileges and rights are considered irrevocably forfeit. The name is immediately struck from the ledger. No reinstatement clause shall apply. Ever. They thought I was just a sad, defeated man letting go of a rebellious teenager. They thought they were simply crafting a new brand, a cleaner slate, an identity that looked better stitched onto a blazer. What they actually did was sign away the only passcode to a generational vault they never even fully comprehended. And I, by signing that consent form tonight, had just turned the key to lock them out forever. I didn't wait until morning. The trust didn't operate on standard banking hours. I picked up the heavy brass telephone sitting on the corner of my desk and dialed a private number from memory. It wasn't the kind of number you program into a cell phone contact list. It was a direct line to the senior managing partner at the legal firm that had overseen the Hawthorne estate for 3 generations. The line rang twice. Then a crisp, professional voice answered the after-hours line. Hawthorne Estate Management. Please state your authorization code. I gave the 10-digit numerical code, followed by my name. This is Alistair Hawthorne. I need to speak to Richard Sterling immediately. One moment, sir, the operator replied. 30 seconds later, Richard's voice came on the line. He sounded completely awake, his tone sharp and alert, despite the fact that it was nearly 1 in the morning. Alistair, I didn't expect to hear from you tonight. Is everything all right? Everything is exactly as it should be, Richard, I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. I need you to activate Provision 12C, effective immediately. A legal name disassociation has occurred. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Richard didn't gasp. He didn't ask me if I was sure, or if I needed time to think about it. He was a machine, programmed to protect the estate above all else. Is the change finalized by a court, or is it still pending? Richard asked, the sound of a keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. The petition is being filed with the state tomorrow morning, I replied. I co-signed the final consent papers 2 hours ago. It is a voluntary adoption and a complete surrender of the surname. Understood, Richard said. Then we will initiate the 72-hour lockout protocol immediately. Pending receipt of the official court confirmation, the trustees will unilaterally suspend Donovan's access to all financial disbursements, educational accounts, and property privileges. And the legacy scholarships? I asked. Suspended, Richard confirmed. Upon verification of the court seal next week, we will file the permanent revision. His name will be permanently struck from the central ledger. Locks and security codes for all estate properties will be updated by sunrise. The holding board will be notified that his developmental observer seat is now vacant. File the permanent revision the second that court document hits the public record, I instructed. Yes, Alistair. It will be done without delay. I hung up the phone. There was no ceremony. No grand, dramatic music playing in the background. Just a quiet, sterile conversation that effectively wiped out a future worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and opened the Instagram app. I rarely used social media, keeping a blank profile just to occasionally monitor Donovan's activities since Caroline had blocked my number from his phone months ago. I navigated to Donovan's public profile. Sure enough, there it was. Uploaded just 45 minutes ago. A perfectly filtered, professional-looking photo of Donovan standing in front of Montgomery's massive swimming pool, wearing that ridiculous navy blazer. He was looking away from the camera, trying to look brooding and sophisticated. The caption read, "Finally, a last name that actually means something. Moving up and moving on. Hashtag Sinclair Legacy." The post already had over 300 likes. Caroline had commented with 3 heart emojis. Montgomery had replied from his own verified account, "Proud to call you my son. The world is yours." I stared at the screen, reading the comments from their wealthy, oblivious friends congratulating him on dropping the dead weight. They looked so incredibly proud of themselves. They were celebrating a victory on a battlefield that didn't even exist. I didn't leave a comment. I didn't send a furious text message. I simply tapped the button on the side of my phone, turning the screen black, plunging the room back into the dim glow of the reading lamp. Montgomery thought influence came from being loud, from buying expensive things and plastering them all over the internet. He thought he had just won a teenage boy's loyalty, a signature on a piece of paper, an inheritance of pure ego. What he didn't know was that in the quiet background, the real empire was currently being shifted out from right under their designer shoes. Donovan had made his statement to the world. I had just made my revision to the ledger. And when that revision became finalized in exactly 3 days, my son wouldn't just lose access to his wealth. He would vanish from the Hawthorne history books as if he had never been born at all. When the sun finally began to rise, casting long, pale streaks of morning light through the tall windows of my study, I had not slept a single wink. The rye whiskey in my glass was gone, and the heavy leather binder was safely locked back inside the wall safe behind the painting. The legal machinery was already moving, turning its massive, invisible gears in offices hundreds of miles away. But there was still physical work to be done here in my own home. I walked out of my study and headed up the grand, curving oak staircase to the second floor. I walked down the long hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runner rug, until I stopped in front of the second door on the left. Donovan's bedroom. I turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. The room smelled faintly of expensive cologne and the crisp, clean scent of the laundry detergent the housekeeper used. It looked exactly as it had the day he packed his designer duffel bags and officially moved into Montgomery's mansion 6 months ago. It was a museum dedicated to a ghost. I didn't stand in the doorway weeping. I didn't collapse onto his perfectly made bed and bury my face in his pillows, wishing things were different. That part of me, the soft, hopeful, desperate father who believed love could overcome manipulation, had died the moment my pen touched the adoption papers last night. I had reached absolute emotional zero. I was operating purely on logic and necessity now. I walked over to the closet, pulled down a stack of heavy-duty cardboard moving boxes, and began the methodical process of erasure. I started with the shelves. I took down the silver baseball trophies he had won when he was 12 years old, back when I was the assistant coach of his Little League team. I wrapped them in old newspaper and placed them into the first box. I packed away his collection of vintage comic books, the ones we used to read together on Sunday mornings before Caroline started scheduling him for elite tennis clinics. I opened his dresser drawers and emptied out the clothes he had left behind, mostly practical, unbranded sweaters and jeans that didn't fit his new, flashy Sinclair aesthetic. I folded them neatly, placing them into large plastic donation bags. Then, I moved to the desk in the corner of the room. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a stack of photo albums. The physical weight of the memories felt heavy in my hands, but my heart remained entirely still. I flipped open the first album. There was a picture of Donovan at 7 years old, covered in chocolate frosting, sitting on my shoulders at a local county fair. Beside it was a photo of him at 10, proudly holding up a terrible, lopsided birdhouse we had built together in the garage. I didn't tear the photos up. I wasn't being dramatic or vindictive. I simply closed the album, placed it at the bottom of a separate box, and sealed it with thick packing tape. I would put it in the attic, out of sight, out of mind. It took me 4 solid hours to clear the entire room. By the time the clock in the hallway chimed noon, the bedroom was completely stripped bare. The walls were blank, the shelves were empty, and the closet was totally hollow. The only things left were the heavy oak bed frame and a bare mattress. I stood in the center of the empty room, looking around. The emotional numbness I had felt all morning was slowly beginning to recede, replaced by something entirely unexpected. It wasn't grief. It was a bizarre, overwhelming sense of freedom. For the past 17 years, every single decision I had ever made was weighed against the future of my son. Every late night at the office, every argument I swallowed to keep the peace with Caroline, every dollar I managed within the trust, was done to ensure that Donovan Hawthorne would one day inherit a legacy strong enough to withstand anything the world threw at him. I had carried the immense, crushing weight of generational expectation on my shoulders, so he wouldn't have to until he was ready. And he had simply looked at that mountain of quiet devotion and called it boring. Now, the weight was gone. The contract was broken. He had demanded his release, and I had granted it. I closed the door to the empty room, the lock clicking sharply in the quiet hallway. I had decided what to do with the space. Tomorrow, I would hire a contractor to tear out the closet, install built-in bookshelves, and convert the entire room into a secondary library. By next month, there would be no physical evidence that a boy named Donovan had ever lived here. The erasure was total and complete. If you are enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling us what city you are watching from. Every single comment helps push the video to more people, and we truly appreciate your support. Stay tuned, because the fallout is just getting started. The first real crack in their perfect, golden illusion did not happen in a courtroom, nor did it happen in a dramatic screaming match. It happened on a random Tuesday evening, exactly 2 weeks after the ink had dried on the adoption papers. I heard the entire story directly from Richard Sterling, the Trust's chief executor, who received the automated merchant alerts on his private server. Donovan had decided to take 6 of his closest friends out for a celebratory dinner at one of the most exclusive, ridiculously expensive steakhouses in downtown Boston. It was a place where the waiters wore white gloves, the menus did not have prices listed, and reservations had to be made 3 months in advance. Donovan had been eating there since he was 10 years old. The general manager, a tall, distinguished man named Arthur, knew him by name. According to Richard's report, the boys had ordered like kings. They devoured massive, dry-aged tomahawk steaks, imported truffles, and towering displays of fresh seafood. They laughed, they bragged, and Donovan basked in the glow of his new, allegedly upgraded life. He was the king of his social circle, a teenager with a bottomless wallet and a brand-new last name to match his brand-new sports car. When the final bill arrived, it totaled somewhere around $2,400. Donovan didn't even flinch. He confidently reached into his designer leather wallet and pulled out the heavy, matte black metal credit card he had carried since he was 16. It was a Hawthorne estate card, linked directly to a minor's trust disbursement account that I had set up to teach him financial responsibility. He dropped the heavy card onto the silver tray and went back to laughing with his friends. 10 minutes later, Arthur, the general manager himself, walked over to the table. He wasn't smiling. He held the silver tray tightly in both hands, looking down at Donovan with an expression of polite, yet profound discomfort. "I am incredibly sorry, Mr. Sinclair," Arthur said, purposely using the new name Donovan had demanded everyone use when he made the reservation. "But this card has been universally declined. The issuer has stated that the account simply does not exist." Donovan laughed, assuming it was a mistake. "Swipe it again, Arthur. Or type the numbers in manually. It is an estate card with 0 limits. There is probably just a security hold because of the amount." Arthur shook his head slowly. "I have already spoken directly with the concierge line at the issuing bank, sir. They were explicitly clear. The account has been permanently closed, and the card is completely deactivated. Do you perhaps have an alternate method of payment?" The table of teenagers fell dead silent. 6 pairs of eyes stared intensely at Donovan. The confident, wealthy aura he had been projecting all evening instantly evaporated, leaving behind a terrified 17-year-old boy who suddenly realized he was stranded. He frantically patted his pockets. He pulled out the standard debit card Montgomery had given him for emergencies, but the daily limit on that card was only $500. It wasn't even close to enough to cover the massive bill he had just racked up. His face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of crimson. In front of the very friends he had been trying to impress, Donovan had to excuse himself, walk into the quiet lobby of the steakhouse, and make a panicked phone call to his new stepfather. Montgomery had to drive 45 minutes out of his way, walk into the restaurant in his ridiculous driving loafers, and hand over his own credit card to settle the tab. Montgomery tried to play it off as a simple banking error, laughing too loudly and clapping Arthur on the shoulder, but the damage was already done. The invincible armor of their new reality had been pierced. It was a small humiliation, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of things, but it was the absolute perfect setup for the total devastation that was hurtling toward them. The restaurant incident was easily brushed under the rug by Caroline. She convinced Donovan that I was just being petty, manually freezing a single credit card out of pure spite. She assured him that Montgomery had infinitely more money anyway, and that we didn't need any of my boring, old man allowance. But late September brought a storm that could not be brushed away with a new designer watch or a pep talk. Donovan was currently in his senior year of high school, applying to colleges. For his entire life, the plan had been for him to attend a highly prestigious, ivy-covered university in Massachusetts. It was the same university my grandfather had attended, the same one my father had attended, and the exact same one I had graduated from. The Hawthorne Educational Trust maintained a massive, multi-million-dollar endowment at this specific university. Because of this, direct, verified descendants of the Hawthorne bloodline were granted an automatic, full-ride legacy scholarship. It covered everything: tuition, room and board in the premium legacy dorms, books, and international study abroad programs. It was a package worth easily over $300,000, guaranteed since the day Donovan was born. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a thick, heavy envelope arrived at the Sinclair mansion. It was from the university's Office of Financial Aid and Legacy Admissions. Donovan ripped it open in the massive, marble-covered kitchen, fully expecting a standard welcome packet or a housing questionnaire. Instead, he pulled out a single, sharply worded letter printed on official university letterhead. I can quote the letter almost exactly, because I had drafted the core language of it with Richard Sterling weeks prior. It informed Donovan that due to a permanent and irreversible change in his legal identity and lineage status, he no longer met the strict foundational criteria required for the Hawthorne Legacy Endowment. Effective immediately, his pre-approved full-ride scholarship was completely revoked. Furthermore, his reserved placement in the historical estate housing was cancelled. If he still wished to attend the university, he was welcome to apply through the standard, general admission pool, and his family would be fully responsible for the $90,000 annual tuition. Donovan stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the paper until the words blurred together. Caroline walked in, fresh from a Pilates class, and snatched the letter out of his trembling hands. She read it once, scoffed loudly, and threw it onto the granite counter. "This is completely ridiculous," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "It is just a clerical error. That old dinosaur Richard Sterling probably hasn't updated their files with your new legal name. I will call the Dean of Admissions right now and have this sorted out before dinner." She picked up her phone, dialed the university, and demanded to speak directly to the dean, throwing around her status as if she were royalty. The secretary placed her on a brief hold, but she wasn't transferred to the dean. She was transferred to the university's legal department. A calm, unbothered lawyer answered the phone. Caroline launched into a furious tirade, accusing them of harassing a minor and threatening to sue the school for discrimination. The lawyer let her scream herself out. Then, with a voice as cold as ice, he read her Provision 12C of the Hawthorne Trust Charter. He explained, using small, very simple words, that the university was legally bound by the terms of the endowment contract. The contract explicitly stated that funds could only be dispersed to a student bearing the Hawthorne surname. By legally adopting the name Sinclair, Donovan had voluntarily voided the contract. "Your son is no longer a recognized member of the estate," the lawyer stated flatly over the phone speaker, loud enough for Donovan to hear every single word. "We are deeply sorry for your misunderstanding of the legal documents you signed, ma'am. But there is absolutely no appeal process. Good day." The line clicked dead. Caroline stood completely still, her phone still pressed against her ear, listening to the dial tone. For the first time in 17 years, she looked at her son, looked at the expensive monogram on his jacket, and realized that her desperate need to stroke her new husband's ego had just cost her child $250,000 in guaranteed education. If the loss of the scholarship was a massive financial blow, the events of early October delivered a fatal, crushing strike to Caroline's social standing. To a woman like my ex-wife, social currency was far more valuable than actual money. Every single autumn for the past 12 years, the city's elite gathered for the Heritage Foundation Gala. It was a spectacular, wildly exclusive black tie event held in the grand ballroom of the oldest luxury hotel in the state. Tickets were virtually impossible to purchase. You had to be invited by the board of directors. For the entirety of our marriage, Caroline and I had held a permanent, front-row VIP table right next to the orchestra. It was prime real estate, allowing Caroline to be seen by every wealthy socialite, politician, and business mogul in the room. When October rolled around, Caroline assumed that nothing had changed. She assumed that her VIP table was tied to her radiant personality and her networking skills, rather than the quiet, powerful last name she used to carry. She spent nearly $10,000 on a custom designer gown. She hired a professional makeup artist to come to the Sinclair mansion. She forced Montgomery into a ridiculously tight tuxedo, and she made Donovan put on his best suit. They were going to make a grand, triumphant entrance as the new, improved Sinclair family. They were going to show high society that they didn't need the boring, old Hawthorne money to command respect. They arrived at the hotel in a chauffeured black luxury SUV. Photographers were clustered near the velvet ropes, snapping pictures of the arriving guests. Caroline stepped out of the vehicle, plastering on her most dazzling, manufactured smile, waving at people she barely knew. They walked up the grand, red-carpeted steps and into the stunning, chandelier-lit lobby. A line of sharply dressed security personnel and event coordinators stood behind a row of podiums, checking names off digital guest lists. Caroline completely bypassed the regular check-in line, grabbing Montgomery by the arm and marching directly up to the head coordinator, a woman named Beatrice who had known us for years. "Beatrice, darling," Caroline chimed, leaning over the podium. "So wonderful to see you. We will take our usual table now. Table 4, right up front." Beatrice did not smile back. She looked down at her glowing tablet, tapped the screen a few times, and then looked back up at Caroline with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "I am so sorry, Caroline," Beatrice said, her voice low enough to keep the conversation private, but firm enough to leave no room for argument. "But there is no reservation under the name Sinclair. And Table 4 is currently occupied by the regional director of the Hawthorne Energy Group." Caroline's fake smile twitched, threatening to fall completely off her face. "Don't be silly, Beatrice. I have sat at Table 4 for over a decade. I am Donovan's mother. We are legacy guests." "You were legacy guests," Beatrice corrected gently, her eyes darting over to the two large security guards standing nearby. "The Hawthorne Trust is the primary benefactor of this entire foundation, Caroline. They sponsor 30% of tonight's event. 2 weeks ago, we received a highly specific, updated exclusion list directly from their legal team." Beatrice turned the tablet around so Caroline could see the screen. Right there, highlighted in bright red text, were 3 names: Caroline Sinclair, Montgomery Sinclair, Donovan Sinclair. Next to the names was a single, bolded word: excluded. "The Trust has explicitly revoked all event privileges for disassociated individuals," Beatrice explained softly, while Montgomery's face turned bright purple with rage. "If I let you into that ballroom, the Foundation loses its largest donor. I am going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately, before I am forced to have security escort you out." People in the lobby were starting to stare. Whispers were spreading like wildfire through the crowd of socialites. The cameras outside were still flashing. Montgomery tried to salvage his pride, pulling out his wallet and aggressively offering Beatrice $5,000 in cash right there on the spot to buy a table. Beatrice simply looked at the money like it was covered in dirt, shook her head, and signaled for the guards. They were turned away. Publicly, humiliatingly, and permanently turned away. They had to walk back out the front doors, past the whispering crowd, past the flashing cameras, and climb back into their rented SUV in total, crushing defeat. Caroline's social empire had completely collapsed, and she hadn't even made it past the front door. The absolute lowest point of their rapid descent did not come from a lawyer, a school dean, or a security guard. It came from inside their own house. 3 days after the disastrous charity gala, the heavy oak front doors of the Sinclair mansion were violently thrown open. Standing in the foyer, breathing heavily, was Wallace. Wallace was Caroline's father. He was 72 years old, a retired structural engineer who had worked hard his entire life to pull himself up into the upper middle class. He was a practical, gruff man who had never fully approved of Caroline's obsession with high society, but he had always deeply respected the Hawthorne family. He knew exactly what kind of quiet, terrifying power the Trust wielded because he had seen it operate from the outside. Wallace marched directly into the massive living room, not bothering to wipe his shoes. His face was completely drained of color, making him look like he had just seen a ghost. In his right hand, he tightly gripped a thick stack of printed emails and legal notices that his own contacts within the banking world had leaked to him. Caroline was sitting on the white leather sofa, sipping an expensive mimosa, trying to pretend the social exile of the past few weeks wasn't bothering her. Montgomery was standing near the fireplace, typing on his phone. Donovan was sitting on the stairs, staring blankly at the floor. "Tell me this is a sick joke," Wallace barked, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. He threw the stack of papers violently onto the glass coffee table. The papers scattered everywhere. Caroline jumped, spilling her drink onto the pristine rug. "Dad? What are you doing here? You can't just barge into our home like this." Wallace ignored her completely. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Donovan. "Did you sign the papers? Did you legally surrender the Hawthorne name?" Donovan looked up, his eyes wide with fear. He had never seen his grandfather look this unhinged. Yes, Grandpa. I changed it to Sinclair. We celebrated it last month." Wallace let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He slumped heavily into a nearby armchair, burying his face in his rough hands. "You fools," he whispered into the quiet room. "You absolute, arrogant fools." Montgomery puffed out his chest, stepping forward to defend his territory. "Listen here, Wallace. I don't appreciate you coming into my house and upsetting my family. Donovan made a choice to be with a real man. The Hawthorne name is just a bunch of old, dusty history. I am his future now." Wallace dropped his hands and looked up at Montgomery. The look of pure, concentrated disgust in the old man's eyes made Montgomery actually take a physical step backward. "You are a tourist," Wallace spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You lease your cars. You finance your boats. You buy flashy watches to convince strangers you are important. You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with." Wallace turned his furious gaze toward his daughter. "And you, Caroline? You were married to the man for almost 15 years. Did you never bother to read the actual trust documents? Did you just assume Alistair was being cheap when he didn't buy a mega yacht?" "It is just a name, Dad," Caroline shouted defensively, her voice cracking. "Alistair is just being a bitter, vindictive ex-husband. He is using his money to punish us because he is jealous of Montgomery. He isn't punishing you." Wallace roared, slamming his fist down on the glass table so hard it rattled. "He didn't do anything. You did this to yourselves. The trust is an autonomous, legally binding fortress built nearly a century ago. It operates entirely on bloodline and legal surname. It doesn't care about feelings. It doesn't care about jealousy. You took the only key to a multi-billion-dollar vault, threw it directly into a wood chipper, and smiled while you did it." Wallace picked up one of the papers from the table and shoved it toward Donovan. "Do you know what you gave up, boy? You didn't just give up a scholarship. You gave up guaranteed medical trusts. You gave up an observer seat on a holding board that controls international shipping lanes. You gave up legacy property deeds in 3 different countries. You gave up a safety net that would have protected your children and your children's children." The room was so quiet you could hear the subtle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "Alistair didn't lock you out," Wallace said softly, his anger draining away, leaving behind only profound sadness. "He just let you walk out the door and locked it behind you. And now you will never, ever get back in." The absolute finality of their situation did not truly sink in until the following Tuesday. It was raining, a cold, miserable autumn downpour that matched the bleak atmosphere inside the Sinclair mansion. No one had spoken much since Wallace's explosive visit. The illusion of their happy, victorious new family was completely shattered, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating sense of dread. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, a private courier pulled up to the front gate. He didn't drive a delivery truck. He drove an unmarked black sedan. He walked up to the heavy front doors, holding a single, thick white envelope, completely devoid of any company logos or return addresses. Caroline opened the door, her eyes red and puffy from days of silent crying. The courier handed her the envelope without a single word, turned around, and walked back to his car. She carried the envelope into the kitchen, dropping it onto the marble island like it was a live bomb. Donovan wandered into the room, his shoulders slumped, wearing plain gray sweatpants instead of his monogrammed blazer. Montgomery was away at his office, desperately trying to leverage his own business connections to replace the funding they had lost, but failing miserably. "Open it," Donovan whispered, staring at the white paper. Caroline picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the thick seal. She pulled out a stack of heavy, cream-colored stationery, stamped with the deep, embossed seal of the Hawthorne Trust. It was the final decree of disassociation. There was no greeting. No, "Dear Caroline," or "To the Sinclair family." It was a clinical, brutal itemization of exactly what they had surrendered. Caroline's hands shook violently as she read the list out loud, her voice breaking on almost every line. Item 1. Total revocation of the undergraduate legacy scholarship, valued at $250,000. Item 2. Permanent removal from the Hawthorne Foundation's Premium Health and Emergency Medical Coverage Trust. Item 3. Immediate forfeiture of the Developmental Observer seat on the Hawthorne Holding Group Board of Directors. Item 4. Immediate revocation of all access privileges to the Vermont Ski Lodge, the coastal estate in Maine, and the private family compound in upstate New York. Item 5. Liquidation and reallocation of the Miners Interest-Bearing Trust Fund, totaling $1.2 million, redistributed to the remaining eligible bloodline heirs. The list went on for 2 entire pages. 24 distinct, life-changing privileges and assets, all stamped with the word revoked in bold, black ink. It was a complete and utter financial execution. Donovan gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he finally comprehended the astronomical scale of his mistake. He had traded a billion-dollar legacy for a few months of riding on a leased yacht. Then, at the very bottom of the thick stack of legal documents, Caroline found one last piece of paper. It was not printed on official letterhead. It was a small, simple ivory card. There were only 8 words written on it, penned in the familiar, elegant script of my silver fountain pen. Caroline read the words silently to herself, her breath hitching in her throat. She dropped the card onto the counter and backed away, covering her mouth with her hands as a heavy, broken sob finally escaped her lips. Donovan stepped forward, leaning over the granite island to read the card. "You asked to leave." I simply held the door. There was no yelling. There was no dramatic confrontation to be had. They could not call the police. They could not hire a lawyer to sue the estate because they had signed the voluntary surrender documents with their own hands in front of witnesses. They were trapped in a prison of their own making. They had demanded a clean break from the Hawthorne name, and I had given them exactly what they asked for. The silence in the kitchen was deafening, the heavy realization crashing down on them that the vault was sealed permanently, and they were standing alone in the freezing cold. The ultimate proof of Donovan's absolute exile did not happen in a bank or a lawyer's office. It happened in the second week of November, under the gray, weeping skies of a private cemetery in upstate New York. My great-aunt Beatrice had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 88. She was a beloved matriarch of the extended Hawthorne family. When Donovan was a little boy, Beatrice used to sneak him sugar cookies before dinner and let him run wild through the massive gardens of her estate. She had loved him dearly. Despite the catastrophic fallout of the past few months, Donovan decided to attend the graveside service. He drove up alone in the sports car Montgomery had bought him, wearing a plain black suit, hoping that in a moment of family grief, the icy walls around him might thaw just a little bit. He parked on the gravel shoulder and walked toward the large, green velvet canopy set up over the burial site. There were over 100 people gathered there, uncles, second cousins, estate managers, and family friends. As Donovan stepped under the canopy, he braced himself for the anger. He expected harsh whispers, dirty looks, or maybe even someone pulling him aside to aggressively reprimand him for what he had done to the family name. He got absolutely none of that. Instead, he got something infinitely worse. He got total, crushing indifference. When he approached a group of his older cousins, men who used to tackle him playfully into the swimming pool during summer barbecues, they didn't glare at him. They simply glanced at him, offered a polite, totally vacant nod, and turned back to their conversation as if a complete stranger had just walked past. He walked up to the front row of folding chairs, assuming he would sit in the designated family section. The usher, a man who had worked for the estate for 20 years, gently but firmly placed a hand on his chest, stopping him. "I am sorry, young man," the usher said softly, his eyes completely blank. "The front 2 rows are strictly reserved for direct family members and named descendants. There is general seating available near the back." Donovan swallowed hard, his throat tight, and walked to the very back row, sitting among the distant acquaintances and hired staff. After the beautiful, somber service concluded, the estate photographer called the immediate family forward to take a traditional, generational photograph near the massive marble mausoleum. "All Hawthorne descendants, please step forward to the steps," the photographer announced, holding a clipboard. Donovan stood up instinctively, taking a step forward. The photographer, checking his master list, looked right through him. "Excuse me, sir," the photographer said politely, holding his hand up to stop Donovan. "I am only calling the names on the verified ledger. The Sinclair family was not included on today's registry. Could you please step aside to clear the frame?" Donovan froze. He looked at the massive crowd of people he had known his entire life. Not a single person stepped forward to defend him. Not a single uncle or aunt waved him over. They simply adjusted their coats, smiled for the camera, and left him standing completely alone in the cold autumn grass. He had erased himself, and the family had simply closed ranks and moved on without him. 3 days after the funeral, Donovan finally sought me out. He didn't come to my estate. He knew the security gates would not open for him. Instead, he tracked me down to a community soup kitchen in downtown Albany, a charity the Hawthorne Foundation had quietly funded for decades, where I volunteered every single Thursday afternoon sorting canned goods in the stockroom. I was carrying a heavy box of vegetables when I heard his voice. "Dad," he said. It was the first time he had used that word in nearly a year. I set the box down on a metal shelf, wiped my hands on a towel, and turned to face him. He looked completely exhausted. The arrogant, chest-puffing teenager from the summer party was gone. He looked small, hollowed out, and utterly defeated. "Alistair," I corrected him calmly. "You gave up the right to use that title when you signed the papers." Donovan flinched as if I had physically struck him. He took a hesitant step forward into the dim stockroom. "I am so sorry. I didn't know. Caroline told me the trust was just a small savings account. Montgomery told me your rules were just you trying to control me. I didn't know about the money. I swear." I looked at him, feeling a profound, heavy sadness, but not a single ounce of regret. "That is exactly the problem, Donovan," I said, my voice steady and quiet. "You think this is about the money. You think you are standing here apologizing because you lost a scholarship and a black credit card." I walked over to him, stopping just a few feet away. This was never about the money. It was about respect. You looked at 17 years of my quiet, grinding devotion. You looked at the nights I stayed awake holding you when you were sick, the years I spent preparing you to carry a massive responsibility, and you spat on it. You threw it away because a flashy man with a leased yacht bought you a watch and told you what you wanted to hear. Donovan started to cry, silent tears tracking down his pale face. "I just wanted to be part of something fun. I wanted to feel important." "And you are important, Donovan Sinclair," I said, intentionally using his new name. "You are exactly what you chose to be. You chose the illusion. You chose the loud, empty room over the quiet, heavy vault. I didn't punish you. I just let you have exactly what you demanded." I turned around, picked up another box of canned goods, and carried it toward the back of the room. "Goodbye, Donovan. Have a good life." He stood there for a long time, the silence of the stockroom pressing down on him. When I finally looked back, he was gone. That evening, I attended the annual, highly private Hawthorne Legacy Gala. It was held behind closed doors, with no press, no flashing cameras, and no rented sports cars. Just generations of quiet, disciplined power. When I stood up to give the opening remarks, looking out over the sea of faces who understood the true weight of our name, I felt a deep, enduring peace. The legacy was safe. The vault was secure. And the ghost of a boy who wanted the world for free had been permanently locked outside the gates. Am I the jerk for letting a 90-year-old clause permanently burn my son's future to the ground? Or did he and his mother get exactly the reality check they asked for? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into family drama. See you in the next one.